My parents, who showed up uninvited to my son's birthday party and later demanded money, filed a false lawsuit claiming I stole $50,000 from them. My name is Mark, and I'm a 28-year-old father who just celebrated his son's third birthday. We had a modest gathering with friends from work and a few of my son's daycare buddies, along with their parents. Given the special occasion, I also invited my estranged parents, who had reached out to me 2 weeks ago, expressing a desire to mend our broken relationship. To fully grasp the complexity of our relationship, a bit of backstory is necessary. 10 years ago, my parents kicked me out of the house just a couple of months before I was set to start college. To add a cruel twist, they chose my 18th birthday to do it. My entire childhood was marked by neglect and a lack of genuine affection. I often felt like a burden, unwanted and ignored. My parents' decision to wait until I turned 18 to kick me out seemed purely legal. As soon as it was permissible, they seized the opportunity to rid themselves of me. Their decision was not entirely unexpected, but the timing was particularly painful. I tried to reason with them, hoping they would at least allow me to stay until I graduated and help cover my tuition fees. However, they had already made up their minds. They wanted me out of their lives so they could pursue their own aspirations, which involved starting a business and traveling across the country in an RV. While I had no issue with them chasing their dreams, it should not have come at the expense of my future. I tried every strategy I could think of to change their minds, from logical arguments to emotional pleas, even breaking down in tears. None of it made a difference. They were resolute and gave me 1 month to vacate the house and figure out my own finances. At that time, I was working as a cashier at a local store and had been saving money to buy a car. After our heart-wrenching conversation, I decided to use those savings to make my escape. I was filled with anger and resentment toward my parents. Although I had never been particularly fond of them, after my 18th birthday, my feelings turned to outright hatred. Within 2 days, I reached out to all my relatives, asking if anyone could offer me a place to stay. Most of them turned me away, which was not surprising given the lack of support I had always felt from them. My friends were supportive, but they had their own lives and could not take me in. Fortunately, one of my mother VJTIN's cousins, Uncle John, responded to my desperate plea and offered me a place to stay, provided I helped out around the house. Desperate for a roof over my head, I packed my belongings and headed to Uncle John's place in Utah. I did not inform my parents, and they did not seem to care. I left without saying goodbye. Uncle John was a kind-hearted man, though a bit quirky. He put me to work with various household chores and gave me a job at his popular local diner. He promised to pay for my college tuition if I worked hard and remained honest. Uncle John was quite well off from his grandparents' inheritance, and without a family of his own, he had the means to help me out. Thanks to Uncle John, I managed to put myself through college. I worked diligently at the diner, proving my commitment and sincerity. After graduating, I moved out and offered to repay him, but he refused, saying he would call in the favor when I was a success. Sadly, Uncle John passed away a few years later, never having asked for anything in return. Back to the present, the birthday party for my son was going well until my parents arrived. Their appearance brought back a flood of memories and emotions. They seemed genuinely eager to reconcile, but I could not help feeling a deep-seated mistrust. After all, these were the same people who had abandoned me when I needed them the most. During the party, my parents attempted to engage with me and my son, trying to act like the loving grandparents they had never been. It was awkward and uncomfortable, but I tried to remain civil for the sake of my son and the other guests. After the party, my parents approached me with a request. They were struggling financially and needed my help. They wanted to borrow a substantial amount of money to bail themselves out of debt. I was taken aback by their audacity. After all these years, after everything they had done, they had the nerve to come to me for money. I politely declined, explaining that I could not afford to help them, especially considering how they had treated me in the past. They did not take it well and left the party in a huff. A few days later, I received a legal notice from my parents. They were suing me for $50,000, accusing me of stealing from them. It was a baseless and outrageous claim, clearly a desperate attempt to get money from me. I was furious and immediately contacted a lawyer to defend myself. The legal battle was stressful and draining, but I stood my ground. I provided evidence of my financial independence and the fact that I'd been supporting myself since they kicked me out. The case was eventually dismissed, but the experience left a bitter taste in my mouth. It was a harsh reminder of the kind of people my parents were. Despite everything, I tried to move on with my life. I focused on my family and my career, determined to provide a better life for my son than the one I had. The encounter with my parents served as a stark contrast to the love and support I wanted to give my own child. I vowed to break the cycle and be the parent I had never had. It was a sudden stroke that took Uncle John from us, and by the time his housekeeper got him to the hospital, it was already too late. I will forever be grateful for everything he did for me. He was there for my wedding, stepping in to fill the void left by my parents, who had shown no interest in my life for years. Uncle John never really got along with his own family, including my mother, whether as a child or an adult. This estrangement meant my parents never found out where I spent those years or who paid for my tuition. Maybe they discovered it but just did not care enough to reach out. Either way, I never heard from them after leaving their house until a few weeks ago. Out of the blue, my parents contacted me, saying they had found me on social media through a cousin who had helped them track me down. They mentioned hearing that I was now married and had a 3-year-old son. In their message, they apologized for their past actions and expressed a desire to make amends, mainly because they wanted to meet my wife and son. Their apology felt half-hearted, and I almost did not reply. However, they sent another message the following day, emphasizing their wish to meet their grandson while they still could, clearly attempting to manipulate me emotionally. Despite my reservations, I agreed and invited them over for my son's birthday. I did not have any particular expectations, but after discussing it with my wife, she said she did not mind as long as I was comfortable with it. My wife knew all about my history with my parents, and we had been married for 5 years. It had been a decade since my parents kicked me out. She suggested that if I believed it was water under the bridge, we could invite them. Her own parents had passed away when she was young, and she was raised by her grandparents, both of whom had died in the last couple of years. I could tell she longed for some family presence at the party. Even though I was not keen on reconciliation, I sensed my wife genuinely wanted them there, so I invited my parents for her sake. They arrived an hour early before the other guests, giving us some time to catch up. The initial meeting was awkward and uncomfortable. We tried to make small talk as I introduced them to my wife and son. They were polite and respectful for the most part, but then my mother asked my wife to make some tea for my father, using it as an excuse to discuss something privately with me. Once my wife was in the kitchen, my parents began to apologize again. They claimed to have come to their senses and acknowledged how poorly they had treated me during my childhood. Initially, I thought it was nice of them to finally apologize and start acting like decent human beings. However, before I could fully accept their apology, they revealed the true purpose of their visit. They admitted they needed money, having depleted their savings while traveling. Now they were struggling to pay their bills and wanted my financial help. Their request infuriated me. It felt like their apology was just a ploy to get me to support them financially. They had even used their grandson to soften me up. While their tactics had little effect on me, my wife had fallen for it, not knowing the full extent of their awfulness. She really missed having family around, which made her keen on fixing our relationship. Seeing her so happy to have them over, I regretted inviting them. I kept silent about their request when my wife returned with the tea. My mother told me to think about it, and my wife asked what we had been discussing. I brushed it off, saying we would talk about it later. I did not want to start an argument with my parents, just as the other guests were about to arrive. The party proceeded, but the earlier conversation weighed heavily on my mind. I struggled to enjoy the event, feeling betrayed and manipulated by my parents once again. After the guests left and we cleaned up, my wife asked me again about the conversation. I hesitated, not wanting to upset her, but I knew I had to be honest. I explained everything, from their apology to their request for money. My wife was shocked and disappointed. She had hoped for genuine reconciliation and was hurt by their ulterior motives. We discussed it at length, and she supported my decision not to give them any money. We agreed that while it was important to be kind and forgiving, we also needed to protect ourselves from further manipulation and hurt. A few days later, I received a legal notice from my parents. They were suing me for $50,000, accusing me of stealing from them. It was a baseless and outrageous claim, clearly a desperate attempt to get money. Furious, I contacted a lawyer to defend myself. The legal battle was stressful and draining, but I stood my ground. I provided evidence of my financial independence and the fact that I had been supporting myself since they kicked me out. The case was eventually dismissed, but the experience left a bitter taste in my mouth. It was a harsh reminder of the kind of people my parents were. Despite everything, I focused on moving forward. I poured my energy into my family and career, determined to create a loving and supportive environment for my son. The encounter with my parents was a stark contrast to the kind of parent I wanted to be. I vowed to break the cycle of neglect and be there for my son, giving him the love and support I never had. As my wife chatted with my parents for a few more minutes, the conversation flowed easily for her. She seemed to like them, which made me feel even more isolated. I sat there quietly, my anger simmering just below the surface, wishing for them to leave before I lost my temper. Thankfully, the first guests arrived just in the nick of time, giving me an excuse to pull myself away from the uncomfortable situation. With the arrival of the guests, I busied myself with helping my son and managing the party arrangements. We moved through the planned activities, and soon it was time for my son to cut his birthday cake. The cake cutting went smoothly, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. Afterward, I intended to head into the kitchen with my wife, but my parents intercepted me, once again asking if I had made a decision about their request. That was the final straw for me. I snapped and told them to wait in the living room with the other guests, promising to let them know my decision shortly. As soon as everyone had received their slice of cake, I took my place in the center of the living room. I had been mentally preparing a speech ever since my parents had confronted me outside the kitchen. I began by introducing my parents to the guests, none of whom had met them before. My parents initially looked pleased that I was acknowledging them, but their smiles quickly faded. I started recounting the story of my childhood, how they had kicked me out on my 18th birthday, and how I had to be taken in by Uncle John. I wrapped up the story with some lighthearted jokes to keep the mood from getting too heavy. The guests laughed, but my parents looked humiliated. My wife maintained a poker face throughout my speech. I mentioned how my parents and I had not spoken for 10 years, until they contacted me recently to meet their grandson. I added, with a touch of sarcasm, that I almost ignored and blocked them, but changed my mind because, unlike other nightmare parents, mine were not after my money. This got a few chuckles from the guests, but it was clear my parents were not amused. After my speech, I rejoined the guests, who took my story as a humorous stand-up bit, which helped maintain the party's upbeat vibe. My parents, however, were visibly upset and left the party in a rush as soon as it was socially acceptable. When I escorted them to the door, they shot me the nastiest looks they could muster, but did not say anything. For that, I was thankful, as the last thing I wanted was a public argument right outside my house. Once the guests had all left, and we had put our son to bed, I finally had a chance to talk to my wife about what had transpired. Before I could explain, she lashed out at me, saying my speech was unnecessary and stupid. She believed I needed to apologize to all the guests, and, more importantly, to my parents for humiliating them without reason. Her anger blindsided me, and I tried to explain my side. I told her about my parents' true motives for their visit, and how they had tried to manipulate me. However, she did not seem to care, and accused me of ruining our son's birthday by making it about me. I thought her reaction was unfair. Our son was only 3 years old, and would not even remember the event in a few years, let alone a few weeks. The guests had found my story amusing because of how I presented it, always mindful that it was my son's birthday. I felt I had managed to call out my parents for their past actions without ruining the party, but my wife was not on board with any of it. She insisted I needed to apologize to everyone for my behavior. Feeling overwhelmed and invalidated, I snapped at her. I reminded her that I had invited my parents mainly because she wanted me to. If anything, I felt she should be the one trying to understand my feelings at that moment. Instead, she was focused on her own feelings and the embarrassment she felt. I accused her of being self-involved, which made her cry. Immediately, I felt a pang of guilt and tried to comfort her, but she shook me off. She told me I was the one being self-involved and hypocritical, and that she would not speak to me until I apologized to everyone at the party. That night, she moved her bedtime things to the guest bedroom and has been sleeping there ever since. We have not spoken since the incident because I have not apologized to any of the guests yet. I stand by my actions and do not feel that what I did was out of line. I believe my wife is overreacting to the situation and failing to see my side of the story. The silence between us has been heavy, and I'm not sure how to bridge the gap without compromising my feelings about what happened. I had not heard back from my parents yet, and none of the guests from the party had mentioned my speech either. I felt like my wife was building it up in her head, convinced people would judge us for it, but that was not the case. Unfortunately, I could not communicate this to her because she refused to speak to me. It felt like she was not trying to understand where I was coming from. I had ignored my parents for her sake and to maintain peace before the party, but I could not take it a second time because they were putting too much pressure on me. During our argument on the night of the party, I mentioned that my wife wanted my parents at the party more than I did, and she did not deny it. She acted as if I had totally ruined the party, but nobody cared as much as she did. I did not want to apologize to anyone because I did not think I had done anything wrong. I tried to handle everything the right way, even though it did not end well for me. My parents had kicked me out at 18 and abandoned me for 10 years, so I thought it was completely fair to humiliate them at the party after they tried to screw me over again by asking for financial help. I tried to deal with things calmly and only acted emotionally when my parents pushed me too far. I really thought my wife needed to understand that. I guess I could apologize for calling her self-involved, as that was not cool, but that was the most I felt I should do. Apart from that, I did not think I had anything to apologize for. I could consider apologizing to the guests, but certainly not to my parents. Update 1: I finally talked to my wife about this today. The comment section on my original post was pretty divided on what I should have done, so I decided to just say screw it and talk to my wife because that is how a marriage should work. It had been 6 days since the party, and 6 days of not talking to each other and sleeping in different rooms. We tried to keep things low-key for our son VDDDJTM's sake, but he was not old enough to notice, so there was even less of an excuse for us not to talk. This morning, before we left for work, I stopped her and insisted we needed to talk. Thankfully, she did not ignore me, and our son was having breakfast in the other room, so we could talk peacefully. I told her I was sorry for calling her self-involved, but that I did not see any other reason to apologize. I explained that I had not ruined the party for anyone like she believed, and nobody had mentioned the speech, not even my parents. I gently and respectfully told her I thought she had overreacted, and then waited for her response. She admitted she had overreacted, and said that once her anger over what I had done had cooled off, she realized she had acted selfishly and had not considered my feelings. She also acknowledged that she had subtly influenced me to invite my parents because she wanted a happy family. Her reasons made sense when I thought about it emotionally. She wanted a complete family, something she never really had as a child. She had hoped that as a married woman, she would get that. But her in-laws were estranged, leaving no chance for her son to receive the same love and affection from his grandparents that she had from hers. Her parents had passed away when she was young, and her grandparents had raised her. It was a big deal for her that her son would not have grandparents to love him. This longing for a complete family had made her react the way she did, and she acknowledged that. I also apologized for not discussing these issues with her and for the lack of communication that had led to the conflict. We talked things through and came to a better understanding. We realized that while our perspectives were different, both were valid. She understood my need to stand up to my parents, and I acknowledged her desire for a family. We agreed to communicate better and not let misunderstandings fester. By the end of our conversation, we had made peace. My wife moved her things back to our bedroom, and we resumed our normal routine, feeling more connected and understanding of each other's feelings. We decided to move forward with a renewed commitment to support each other and ensure our son grows up in a loving and communicative environment. While we may not have the extended family my wife had hoped for, we realize that the family we have built together is more important. Our son will grow up knowing he is loved by his parents, and that is what truly matters. After our conversation, my wife and I concluded that we would need to address these issues in therapy. While we both attend individual therapy, we decided to consider couples counseling to work through our communication problems and other unrelated issues. Thank you all for your comments and support. Update 2: I posted an update yesterday, not expecting to return so soon. But here I am, thanks to my parents. They filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that I had stolen $50,000 from them before I left 10 years ago. Now that they had finally tracked me down, they wanted the money back. This accusation is entirely false, and I feel sorry for the attorney who agreed to take on their case. It must be someone in desperate need of money, because I cannot imagine anyone else agreeing to this nonsense. Of course, I am not going to entertain any of this absurdity. I contacted my lawyer immediately. My wife has since retracted her statements about me needing to apologize to my parents, now seeing clearly what kind of people they really are. My parents probably thought they could get away with this because I had been relatively kind when they first visited, as it was my son's birthday. But now, I have no reason to hold back. I decided to post everything online to ensure everyone knows not only what my parents are trying to do now, but also what they did to me in the past. Update 3. I posted all the details on my Facebook profile. It has been about 20 minutes, and while I have not yet received any texts or calls, I am certain that people will react strongly. I specifically mentioned how none of my family members took me in when I was kicked out, but now that I am in a decent position, everyone acts friendly. Just to be clear, I have not invited any relatives to any events. However, those who shut me out back then have recently tried to be on good terms with me. Their friendliness is obviously fake, driven by their own interests, since I am now a well-connected individual working in a bank, capable of helping them secure jobs. I know things are about to get messy, and I am just waiting for the fallout. Update 4. Hey everyone, I am back after almost 3 days. As expected, my parents went completely ballistic after I made that post. They called me frantically multiple times, begging me to take it down. I ignored their calls until they texted me, promising to withdraw their case if I removed the post. I made sure to get that promise in writing. Once I had it, they blocked me. The real drama came from my relatives. I had mentioned them by name in my post, and they were so triggered that they left nasty comments about me, my wife, and even my son. This only proved my point about their selfish and idiotic nature. Interestingly, their children were the ones who showed decency, apologizing for their parents' actions. It was ironic, but at least some people had class and brains. I have taken the post down now, but a lot of people saw it. Everyone who turned their back on me in the past has faced their karma, and I am glad for it. In the end, my parents withdrew their case. I have distanced myself from those toxic relatives, and my wife and I are still going strong. Thank you for being here, Reddit. I think I am going to take a break now. Signing off, goodbye.